That day, in general, had been beautiful, full of warm moments and laughter shared between Alejandro, my parents, and me. Everything seemed to be in its place, except for Valeria. From the moment we entered the house, she adopted a strangely flirtatious attitude, one that could not go unnoticed, especially by me. I had waited, almost with resignation, for him to make one of his usual sarcastic comments about me in front of Alejandro, as he usually did on other occasions. But what he did this time was different. They were not scathing words or criticisms disguised as jokes. It was something much more uncomfortable and calculated. Valeria seemed extremely interested in Alejandro. I laughed too hard at his jokes, even those that were barely casual comments. She was staring at him as she spoke, leaning towards him in a way that was impossible to ignore. At one point, while they were talking, she touched his arm, a seemingly innocent action, but loaded with an intention that could not be misinterpreted. Alejandro looked uncomfortable, so much so that he subtly moved his chair a little further away from her. I watched all this from my place at the table, feeling the discomfort turn into a knot in my stomach. My parents, however, seemed completely oblivious to Valeria's behavior. Even when she made comments like, "You look so good today, Alejandro," with a smile that left little to the imagination, they just continued chatting as if nothing was happening. This indifference was a pattern I already knew. They had always been unable to see the problems I saw in my sister's behavior. To be honest, it wasn't the first time she had seen Valeria act that way around a man. Since we were teenagers, he had a peculiar way of behaving when he was around boys. His tone of voice became softer, more honeyed, and his movement seemed calculated to attract attention. But this time it was different. This time it was Alejandro, my boyfriend, the man with whom I was building a serious relationship. It was a line I never thought I would cross. When dinner was over and we all began to clear the table, my mother, with a carefree smile, whispered something to me that left me stunned. "It's nice, isn't it? Your sister has a harmless little crush on Alejandro. It probably just means he approves of it too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Harmless? To my mother, this was a display of innocent affection, something worthy of laughter. But for me, it was a clear violation of boundaries and a source of constant discomfort. I felt a wave of frustration that I had a hard time containing. When my mother didn't do anything about it, I decided to confront Valeria directly. I confronted her in her room, away from the ears of my parents and Alejandro. "What were you doing?" I asked him bluntly. Valeria, with her typical carefree attitude, shrugged her shoulders. "What do you mean? I was just being nice. Alejandro is cute, isn't he? I can't help it if I find him really charming." His response, full of false innocence, made my blood boil. "It's not about what you think of him, Valeria. It's about how you act." It was uncomfortable for me and Alejandro. "You have no right to behave that way, especially with my boyfriend." For the first time in a long time, my words seemed to affect her. His face turned red with rage, and without saying anything else, he ran towards his room, slamming the door. Although her reaction was extreme, I didn't regret confronting her. I knew I had done the right thing by drawing that line. After that incident, Alejandro and I decided to limit his visits to my house. He himself admitted that he didn't feel comfortable being around Valeria, something she couldn't blame him for feeling. Our relationship continued, but with caution regarding my sister. Eventually, Alejandro and I started college. Even though our universities were almost an hour apart, we promised each other that we would make the relationship work. We talked every day, maintaining a connection that seemed to grow stronger with distance. But even through the distance, Valeria found ways to try to interfere. One day, Alejandro casually mentioned to me that Valeria had sent him a friend request on Facebook. At first, he didn't think much of it and accepted it, assuming it was nothing more than a harmless gesture. However, almost immediately, she started sending him messages. Alejandro, uncomfortable, told me everything, worried about the situation. "It's strange," he told me. "We haven't talked in months, and suddenly he's messaging me like we're close friends." Valeria, who hadn't even bothered to send me a message since I left for university, was now spending time writing to Alejandro. His messages were ambiguous, but persistent. When I asked my mother to intervene, Valeria reacted as usual, raising her voice and refusing to listen to reason. That was the moment I realized that my relationship with Valeria was more broken than I had thought. Not only was she willing to cross boundaries, but she seemed to enjoy the consequences of her behavior. Suddenly, Valeria was sending messages to my boyfriend, Alejandro. I couldn't understand it. We had had our differences before, but this crossed every boundary I had imagined. What was he looking for? Why now? Over the next few days, I noticed how Valeria's messages to Alejandro became more frequent and brazen. "Good morning, handsome," she wrote, or "Good night, thinking of you," followed by heart emojis. It didn't matter that Alejandro didn't respond. She kept sending messages with a disconcerting persistence. The last straw came when he started commenting on her social media posts. "How hot you look," he wrote in one of his photos, accompanying the message with a rose emoji. All this made my blood boil. Alejandro, for his part, seemed uncomfortable, although he tried to remain calm so as not to escalate the situation. After discussing it together, we both agreed that it was time to confront her. One afternoon, with Alejandro sitting next to me, I picked up the phone and dialed Valeria's number. My voice was firm, determined, but my heart was racing. When he responded, I wasted no time in detours. "Valeria, can you explain to me why you are sending messages to my boyfriend behind my back?" At first, he tried to act like he didn't understand what I was talking about. "I just wanted to know how you were," he said, with a voice full of false innocence. But I wasn't going to be fooled. "Don't make excuses," I replied firmly. "If you really wanted to know how I was doing, you could have asked me. There was no reason for you to do it on the sly, sending him messages as if I didn't exist in this equation." His attempts to justify his behavior only increased my anger. I made it clear to her that her behavior was unacceptable, that Alejandro was going to block her, and that if she tried something similar again, I would not hesitate to show the messages and comments to our parents. "This isn't just uncomfortable for Alejandro," I added. "It is disrespectful towards me and towards our relationship. If you have any decency, this has to stop right now." For the first time, I saw Valeria lose her composure. His tone went from defense to rage. He accused me of exaggerating, saying that his messages weren't a big deal, and went so far as to insinuate that Alejandro was lying about being uncomfortable. But I didn't let myself be intimidated. "This is your last warning," I said, in a tone that left no room for doubt. "If you really respect me, you will stop this immediately." When I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Alejandro took my hand and assured me that I had done the right thing. After that confrontation, he blocked her, and we both felt relieved. It was a necessary step to protect our relationship from his toxic behavior. However, as expected, my relationship with Valeria was completely fractured. Every time I came home during college holidays, she completely ignored me, as if I didn't exist. My parents noticed the change, but did nothing significant about it. My mother, in her usual problem-minimizing way, dismissed it by saying, "Fights between sisters are normal. Valeria is just going through a phase. You'll see how everything works out over time." But I knew that this was not a simple stage. The damage was done, and there was no turning back. Time passed, and Alejandro and I managed to maintain our long-distance relationship during the university years. It was a challenge, but we came out stronger. After I graduated, we moved in together, and life finally started to feel like a puzzle that fit together perfectly. Alejandro was my rock, my constant support, and together we built a life full of love and complicity. One day, to my complete surprise, Alejandro proposed to me. It was a magical moment, one of the happiest of my life. After everything we had been through together, taking that step was a dream come true. Our parents were delighted, and we soon began excitedly planning the wedding. However, as always, Valeria found a way to complicate things, although this time indirectly. My mother, in her tireless attempt to restore our relationship, insisted that Valeria must be part of the special day. "You should ask her to be one of your bridesmaids," she suggested with a hopeful smile. The idea filled me with doubts. I knew my mother only wanted the best for both of us, but could I really trust Valeria to play that role at my wedding? Could she put her resentments aside and behave appropriately? Or would she end up doing something that would ruin the most important day of my life? When I decided to ask Valeria to be one of my bridesmaids, I did so with a mixture of nerves and resignation. I knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but prodded by my mother and her constant insistence that family comes first, I picked up the phone and called. To my surprise, Valeria rejected the proposal directly and bluntly. He offered no explanation, just a dry no. But it didn't stop there. He also made it clear that he would not attend my wedding. My parents, as expected, tried to mediate the situation, trying to convince her to change her mind. However, Valeria stood firm. His refusal was irrevocable. Deep down, although a part of me felt hurt, I couldn't help but feel a certain relief. Not having Valeria around meant I wouldn't have to worry about any unnecessary drama on one of the most important days of my life. So, I decided to let it go. The following years were a blur of events and changes. Alejandro and I built a life together, full of ups and downs, but always supporting each other. Valeria, on the other hand, was completely left out of my life. He barely crossed my mind until, about 7 months ago, his name came up again in the most unexpected way. It was an ordinary, quiet night when Alejandro, while checking his social media, mentioned something that made my heart stop. Do you know that Emilio uploaded a photo with his new girlfriend? He said casually. But look at this. He handed me the phone, and there it was. In the photo, next to Emilio, smiling radiantly, was Valeria, my sister. My heart skipped a beat. What was Valeria doing with Emilio, Alejandro's cousin? The idea of her being involved with someone so close to us completely baffled me. My first thought was whether this could be an intentional move on his part. After everything that had happened between us, after her strange behavior with Alejandro in the past, I couldn't help but feel that there was something more behind this. Driven by confusion and the need for clarity, I decided to contact Emilio directly. We had always had a good relationship, so I felt I could broach the topic without causing too much of a stir. When I mentioned Valeria, Emilio spoke enthusiastically. He told me how they had met at the gym months before and how the connection between them had been instantaneous. He seemed genuinely happy. However, when I asked him if he knew that Valeria was my sister, he admitted that he knew. But he also revealed something that stunned me. Valeria had specifically asked him not to mention it to me. According to him, he did not want this to cause family problems. That answer set off all the alarms in my head. Why did Valeria want to keep their relationship a secret? What was he trying to avoid? With my heart pounding, I felt like I had no choice but to tell Emilio the truth. I told him everything. The years of resentment, the boundary crossings with Alejandro, and the reason he had cut off contact with Valeria. I explained to him how his behavior had affected our relationship and how it had been a constant source of tension in the past. I hoped Emilio would understand my concerns, or at least be willing to listen with an open mind. But instead, he became defensive. He seemed angry that I dared to mention all this. He argued that Valeria had been nothing but kind to him and was probably exaggerating or misinterpreting past events. His reaction left me frustrated and hurt. Later, when I told Alejandro about my conversation with Emilio, his response was no better. He was furious. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in their relationship," he told me, his tone firmer than usual. "This is not our business." I tried to explain my intentions to him, how I only wanted to protect Emilio and make sure he was aware of Valeria's story. But Alexander was not willing to give in. "Maybe Valeria has changed," he finally said. "Maybe you should give him the benefit of the doubt." Although his words left me with mixed feelings, I decided that, for the sake of my marriage, I needed to back off. In the following months, Emilio and Valeria began to make their relationship public. Our parents, although initially uncomfortable with the situation, chose to accept Emilio's version that everything had been a simple coincidence. For me, it was hard to believe. Valeria had always been calculating, and her presence in our lives now felt like a shadow that threatened to rekindle old wounds. But, for the moment, He had no choice but to watch from a distance, hoping that this time things wouldn't end in disaster. Alejandro and I had done our best to keep our distance from Valeria and Emilio. Family gatherings had become uncomfortable territory for us, so we avoided them as much as we could. But this weekend, Emilio extended us a direct invitation to his opening party. Apparently, he and Valeria had decided to move in together, and this event was their way of celebrating. He insisted so much that we attend that, although we hesitated, we accepted to avoid a major conflict in the family. From the moment we arrived, I knew that this party was not going to end well. Emilio, clearly excited, was milling around among the guests, proclaiming how in love he was with Valeria. He talked about how they were soulmates destined to meet, and his enthusiasm was almost contagious. If it weren't for the fact that Valeria seemed completely oblivious to it all. Instead of sharing her joy, she seemed indifferent, distracted, and on more than one occasion I noticed how she looked at Alejandro from across the room. As the afternoon progressed, Valeria's attitude became more disturbing. He drank more than any other guest, filling one glass after another, and his face was beginning to take on that characteristic alcohol glow. At one point, Alejandro excused himself to go to the bathroom. He had barely disappeared down the hallway when Valeria saw her chance. I saw her get up quickly and follow him. My heart sank. When Alejandro returned, his expression was tense, and I knew immediately that something had happened. He took me aside and, with contained calm, told me what had happened. Valeria had intercepted him in the hallway, apparently trying to start a private conversation. But when he told her that, whatever she had to say, she could do it in front of me, Valeria lost control. In a tone thick with alcohol, he began to confess his feelings. She told him that she had always been in love with him, that everything she had done over the years was to be close to him. Her voice cracked as she accused him of rejecting her and choosing someone she claimed wasn't as good as her. Before he could react, Emilio appeared on the scene. Unfortunately, he had heard every word of Valeria's confession. His face, which moments before was full of enthusiasm, now reflected a mixture of shock, pain, and humiliation. The guests began to murmur, creating an atmosphere of unbearable tension. Alejandro, true to his character, handled the situation with as much grace as possible. He told Valeria, in a firm but calm tone, that her feelings didn't matter because he had always been in love with me. But this only made Valeria angrier. His rage exploded in a torrent of incoherent words and tears. Emilio, in a desperate attempt to control the situation, tried to get her out of the room before she caused more damage. But he couldn't prevent the drama from already unfolding in front of everyone. We decided it was better to leave. The tension was palpable, and the situation had become a spectacle that neither of them wanted to witness. However, shortly after our departure, I learned that the party had ended in absolute chaos. Emilio and Valeria had had a monumental fight. She, in a state of fury and drunkenness, had begun to throw plates and glasses, shouting accusations and demands at Emilio. According to those present, it all culminated with Valeria demanding to know why he was not enough for her and why she still loved Alejandro. Days later, Emilio's parents called me to talk about what happened. They were understandably upset and wanted to understand what was happening with Valeria. I reiterated what I had told them before. Valeria had always had a strange obsession with Alejandro, something that had caused years of tension between us. I explained to them that although I wanted Emilio to be happy, I had always feared that Valeria would ruin what he touched. Later, Emilio made the difficult decision to end the relationship. According to his family, he tried to be as respectful as possible, but Valeria did not take the news maturely. In a fit of rage, he trashed his apartment, breaking furniture, scratching his car, and, in a childish and vengeful act, spreading glitter all over the house, a mess that Emilio now had to clean up alone. Emilio's parents called me again, this time demanding that I speak to my sister. Valeria wasn't responding to their messages or calls, and they felt like I was the only one who could make her see reason. But as I listened to their complaints, I couldn't help but wonder, what else could I do? He had tried to warn them, tried to protect them from the storm he knew Valeria could unleash, but no one listened to me. Now, as I look at my phone and the missed calls from Emilio's parents, I feel a mix of guilt, frustration, and resignation. I knew that sooner or later Valeria would be responsible for her actions, but I never imagined that her fall would be so devastating and public. The day Emilio's parents called me to demand that Valeria pay for the damages, I felt the tension built up for years finally reach a breaking point. His tone was stern, almost threatening. They wanted me to make sure Valeria took full responsibility, and if she didn't, they were prepared to take legal action. But what really stunned me was her implication that, as an older sister, I should also be held responsible. I tried to remain calm as I explained, once again, that I had no control over Valeria's actions. I reminded them that I had tried to warn them and Emilio from the beginning about my sister's behavior, but their words stuck like thorns. You should have done more. She's your sister, and you're just as guilty as she is for not stopping her. After hanging up, I sat on the couch, feeling completely exhausted. Emilio's mother's words echoed in my head. Should I have done more? Was it my fault that all of this had escalated to this point? Alejandro came home shortly after, and when I told him what had happened, he placed a reassuring hand on mine. This is not your responsibility, he said firmly. I'll talk to my family and we'll figure this out. You have nothing to worry about. Her support was a relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Valeria had managed to turn my life into chaos, even without being physically present. Alejandro took the opportunity to apologize for not having completely believed me when I warned him about the warning signs with Valeria years ago. Although his words were sincere, they also left a bitter aftertaste. How many problems could have been avoided if someone had listened to me from the beginning? In the following days, things began to take an unexpected turn. My parents, who until then had defended Valeria on many occasions, finally intervened. Apparently, after her outburst at Emilio's apartment, Valeria had come to them in tears. He was living in his house, taking refuge from the consequences of his actions. When I explained what had happened at the party and the damage it had caused, my mother and father took matters into their own hands. They personally called Emilio and his parents to apologize. They promised to cover all repair costs and ensure that Valeria would not cause problems again. It was a relief to learn that Emilio was not planning to press charges against him, but his parents' frustration was still evident. Although after a few days, they themselves called me to apologize for their initial attitude towards me. They admitted that they had spoken out of anger and bewilderment, and I accepted their apology with grace, understanding the weight of the situation. A month later, things finally started to stabilize, at least for Alejandro and me. Valeria, on the other hand, was facing the result of her decisions. My parents, emotionally and financially exhausted after covering thousands of dollars in damages, gave him an ultimatum. He had 1 month to find his own place and move out. It was a hard decision, but necessary. Valeria had never held a stable job. I had always depended on my parents or their relationships for financial support, and now I would have to face a reality that I had long avoided. My mother, who had often defended her no matter what, seemed to have finally reached her limit. His disappointment was palpable, and for the first time, he stopped justifying Valeria's actions. As for me, I was relieved. Although I did not want to see my sister go down, it was a comfort to know that she would have no more power to disrupt the peace in my life or Alexander's. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. Alejandro and I moved forward, strengthened by the challenges we had faced together. Our marriage was in a good place, and although the emotional scars Valeria had left were still visible, we felt closer than ever. Life sometimes has a strange way of working things out. Although the road had been tumultuous, I could now look to the future with hope, knowing that my sister would no longer be a constant shadow in our relationship.